Thank you. It's really great you all came out tonight. We're very excited about what we're going to be hearing tonight. For those that don't know me, my name's Martin Keystone, principal here at the school, and I'd like to give you a warm welcome to our school. It's really lovely to have a big group here. Stephen was just saying he's not spoken to such a big group before, so which I'm a little sceptical because I see him on TV. But anyway, step. I'd just like to make a few comments to turn open this prayer before we get started. But just in Ephesians 6 verse 4, the Apostle Paul, he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Now, this verse has been a mainstay in Christian education for a long time, as long as I've been involved in Christian schools and long before that. But interestingly, the Greek word that's translated discipline and instruction is actually paideia. And we get words like pedagogy from that, which is the practices of instruction. But it's a very rich word to the people of Paul's day. It's one of those words that refers to that Greek ideal of creating the perfect man. That was what they were after. But unfortunately, of course, they were looking at people like Achilles and other false pagan ideas. But the Christians at that time grabbed it and realised we know who the perfect man is, and that's Christ. So, and out of that came what we now call classical Christian education, at least the theory of it. It's been in and out, from my research, it's been in and out of education for over 1,000 years, but certainly 1,500 years. It's been a big aspect of Christian education. But Paul, in that text, you'll notice he says it's not just paideia, it's also, he adds of the Lord on the end. And that's that idea of pointing us in the direction of a Christian, a distinctly Christian approach to paideia, which is that enculturation of the ideal human being. But of course it's pointing us to Christ, as I said. Now, tonight's our annual Foundations of Christian Education event. We run one of these every year, and it's intended to provide a forum to explore topics relevant to what we're doing as a school. Now, as a school, we are seeking to develop our educational offering to be in the liberal arts division. Now, it's very early days for us, but that's what we see the value of it, and we're getting friends in the movement, and it's definitely something that's quite, you may or may not know, but there's actually several classical Christian schools starting up in Australia in the last 2 years. There's been quite a lot of activity in this space, so we're quite encouraged by what's happening. We're trying to also develop friendships with various institutions who will help us on the way. That's like-minded schools and other institutions. Now, one such institution is Campion College. Now, it's in Sydney, and that's Australia's first liberal arts college. And it's a really delightful place. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr Paul Morrissey. He's the president of Campion College, and he very kindly shared Stephen to us to come tonight. He was intending to come himself, but he couldn't make it, so we're very happy to have Stephen. Now, Stephen's the senior history lecturer at Campion College, and he's authored a few books. I'm not sure exactly how many, and you may have seen him on TV from time to time. That's what Sky News, I think, I've seen you on, definitely. And he's come all the way from Campbelltown to join us tonight, so we're really grateful for that. So he's going to speak to us tonight on the topic, Every Thought Captive, why the liberal arts are more important than ever. And there will be a time for questions at the end. We've also got a light supper here, but I hope you'll stay and chat. And of course, Stephen's indicated he's going to be around, so if you wanted to chew his ear over a coffee, he'd be more than happy to do that before he heads back. I'd now like to open in prayer, and then I'll invite Stephen to speak to us. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we do thank you for your amazing grace, and we thank you for bringing Stephen here with us tonight. We thank you too for what you're doing in this area of classical and Christian education across the world, particularly in the US, but also spreading even to Australia. We pray that you would help us to be encouraged to learn, and we thank you for the wisdom and experience you've given to Stephen in this area. And so we pray your blessing on him as he speaks to us, and on all of us as we reflect on the fact that you are always active, even in the worst of times. And so help us to have our trust in you, our true and living God. In his name we pray. Amen. So let's welcome Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's a real honor to be here. And it's a beautiful, beautiful library. And I was very excited to get this invitation, particularly to hear of another school going down the liberal arts, classical education, studia humanities road. And I guess I'm going to spend the next half hour, 35 minutes, maybe a bit more, not too much more, don't worry, explaining why I actually think that's a really good move. Maybe offering something of a justification for such a move. Now, because I make a living writing and teaching history, I really should put some history into this talk. So I've done that. So you might hear some quotes and things about the history of education that you haven't heard before, because I've got to talk a bit about Australian history. Here we go. We talk about the word education, actually. Of course, many of you will know that the word educate is the Latin version of the Greek word pedagoge, both of them meaning, the Latin word literally meaning to lead up, or to lead out of. The Greek word pedagoge literally meaning to lead a child. And that is really the distinction that has always been drawn between an education and a training. An education is about effectively leading a child into maturity, leading a child, in a sense, out of childhood, into adulthood, into maturity, into virtue. And that is precisely the kind of education that we want to be focusing on, something that creates character, not just endows one with skills. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Education and its nature has been deeply discussed and fiercely debated in Australia, at least as far back as the 1830s. If you're having trouble hearing me, just let me know and I'll try and raise my voice a bit more. The historian of Australian education will find literally hundreds of learned newspaper editorials, newspaper articles, tracts, speeches and books written throughout the colonies on the purpose and nature of education. And I know this because I went all around Australia photographing them. I've got thousands of photographs of all of these things, and you can find a lot of them online in trove. By the time we get to the 1850s in Australia, the task of education is, to a large extent, the task of creating citizens fit for what was emerging at the time in the West, and that was democracy. The state, wrote William Wilkins, Inspector of Schools in New South Wales, representing the whole body of citizens, he says, has a direct interest in education inasmuch as the successful working, if not the very preservation of its democratic institutions, depends largely upon the virtue and intelligence of its subjects. End quote. What kind of education did people think would be a good one? Again, the answer tended to be in terms of character development, not merely skills or training, as they would have called it back then. Very early on in Australia's education debates, the humanities, or the liberal arts, was proposed as a serious model. The first ever professor at Sydney University, the Reverend John Woolley, advocated for just such an education. He lamented the common opinion, as he saw it, in colonial Australia, that demanded education to be solely tied to getting a job or economic usefulness. In contrast to this mere utilitarian view of education, quote, "A liberal education," said Woolley, "is one which cultivates and develops in their due and harmonious proportion what the Romans called humanitas, or humanity, all those faculties and powers which distinguish man from the inferior creatures, that distinguish man from beast." Later in Australian history, Sir Robert Menzies, who wrote an awful lot about the nature of education. In fact, one of the best things Menzies ever wrote in his whole life was an article he wrote in his university newspaper, the Melbourne University Magazine, in 1916 on the purpose of a university. It's just one of the best things he ever wrote in his life. And he was born in 1894, so he would have been in his early 20s when he wrote it. It was a remarkable piece. Robert Menzies spent much of his political career, and it was a very long career, defending what he classed as, a quote, classical education, or, quote, the humanities, against conceptions of education designed solely to fit citizens into technical vocations. He said, quote, "Civilization in the true sense requires a close and growing attention not only to science and all its branches, but also to those studies of the mind and spirit of man, of history, of literature and language, and mental and moral philosophy, the relative neglect of which has left a gruesome mark on this century." He wrote that, that was from a speech in about 1945 that he gave to Parliament. What he described there was really a liberal education. Thus, we can all see that there is nothing novel or historically eccentric about the idea and ideal of a liberal, classical, great books or humanities-focused education curriculum in Australia. In fact, most of the deepest thinkers on the nature of education in Australian history have praised just such an ideal. So in a way, those parents and schools who wish to go down the path of the liberal arts are also recovering a mainstream Australian tradition of pedagogical thinking. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So said the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians in a civilization that prided itself on wisdom and learning. And yet, it would be a mistake to assume that prior to thoughts being made captive to Christ, that they are free. The idea of the free thinker is to a large extent a vainglorious myth. All people's minds are captive to some way of making sense of existence, some religion, some ideology. The difference is whether the master of the mind is bringing it to truth and virtue, or error and vice. In other words, education and curriculum debates are really battles for minds. If a free mind or thinking freely has any meaning, it's the mind so trained and formed that its habit is to seek truth and virtue. I prefer not to idealize so-called free thinking, but truthful and virtuous thinking. After all, there is nothing commendable in a mind that is free from truth and virtue. In fact, we have a word for such a mind: deluded and depraved. So I submit to you that at no point in human history have governments and corporations had a greater power to captivate the minds of the youth than they do in our technological age. Governments have never been bigger. Technology has never been more invasive and far-reaching. We live in an age where all children around the Western world are forced to be educated by the state, and the overwhelming majority are formed by a state-devised curriculum, albeit with some flexibility. Furthermore, we're in an age where mass advertisement and the rise of social media, movie and TV streaming services and iPhones, and means that the minds of the youth are almost 24/7 being shaped, dare I say it, groomed, certainly captive by images and messages. Culture-forming institutions like universities, legislatures, courts, the media, and entertainment are not free-thinking institutions. They are captive to a prevailing kind of secular humanism, increasingly called wokeism, or better still, a corporate-sponsored Marxian cultural revolution in which the enemy is not merely capitalism, but all vestiges of Christian civilization itself. Furthermore, a strong narrative or story is being told through all of these avenues. It's basically something like this that the kids are hearing. You can be the hero of your own story if you just become who you truly are, and then spend your life overturning and destroying everything that stops others becoming who they truly are. The evil force that must be destroyed is basically Western Christian civilization at its foundations. Narratives are very, very powerful. And the basic narrative that kids are getting these days is that you can be a superhero if you jump onto a whole bunch of causes that essentially are either expressions of neo-paganism or really just all kinds of attempts to undermine any contribution that Christianity has made to Western civilization. That's a very, very powerful and seductive narrative. The biblical God, the creator-creation distinction, male and female, marriage, the family, true religion, self-restraint, and the political and economic institutions that have historically emerged from all of this are not merely the object of constant explicit and implicit criticism from government curricula, the media, corporations, entertainment, and often churches, but they are under actual attack and being deconstructed by activists who have burrowed into our education systems, public service, and legislatures. The task to dismantle this superstructure of secular humanist mental captivity, mental in both senses of the term, I think, must be a long-term one, a counter-long march through the institutions. The counter-offensive is underway for sure, and we're part of it. But what do we do in the meantime? The immediate task now is to equip the minds of the youth with the intellectual ability and virtues to recognize and resist the forces that would captivate their minds to delusion and vice and ultimately misery. As I said, the present secular humanist moment has a powerful and highly seductive narrative that appeals especially to the youth. It's about heroism and it's about destroying things. To combat this, we require a more powerful counter-narrative to offer, and we have it. The triumph over death and evil by the God-man Jesus on the cross, and our calling, male and female, child and adult, to resist and fight the forces of evil in full confidence and knowledge of the reality of Christ's victory accomplished. But how do we fight evil? How do we equip ourselves? The Apostle Paul gives us the best practical advice, namely, to fix our eyes on what is unseen and eternal, to think about what is honourable and pure and just. This is precisely how we carry out the Apostle's exhortation to not conform to the pattern of this world and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then, says Paul, you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. This is a whole pedagogical approach that the Apostle Paul has just offered us. This conception of education is also nothing new in historical mainstream Australian thinking. William Rusden, Australian educationalist of the mid-19th century, approvingly quoted Milton when defining the goal of education. He wrote, this is Milton now being quoted by Rusden, "The end of learning is the repair of the ruins of our first parents, by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest, by possessing our souls of true virtue, which, being united to the heavenly grace of faith, makes up the highest perfection." Can you imagine a Victorian educationalist saying that today? It's just amazing. The past really is a foreign country. But that's how people thought in the 19th century. So what does all this have to do with the liberal arts? Simply that the best way to ensure that every mind is captive to Christ is through a Christian liberal arts curriculum that inducts the youth into the intellectual and moral virtues required to both recognise and resist the immiserating secular humanist narrative of the age. Make no mistake, we have in the West the richest literary, artistic and scientific heritage imaginable, which is not to say that other civilizations do not have their own remarkable achievements, or even that the West did not benefit from the achievements of other civilizations. But our own Western heritage furnishes us with the tools to construct an education curriculum that equips students to recognize and resist our age's hollow and deceptive philosophy. Thus, some of the constituents of such an education are as follows. Literature, or narratives and stories that teach moral virtues and a life of responsibility as opposed to moral relativism, or today's sort of understanding of the good life as unrestrained liberty and rights. This means teaching stories and literature to children and the youth whose protagonists come through trials to realize and appreciate the true, the beautiful, and the good, while also showing the real-world effects of fleeing the hard-achieved virtues for immediate gratification and unrestrained liberty. Yeah. Literature can have an immense appeal to both boys and girls if the curriculum is sensitive to their respective psychological tendencies. It's pretty well known that girls have a stronger disposition for fiction and fictional literature, whereas boys gravitate more towards non-fiction. Boys also respond well to the literature that focuses on the mission, virtuous heroism, conflict, overcoming obstacles and challenges, and teamwork. To repeat though, the point of literature in a liberal arts education is to prevent students with concrete examples of the virtues to be pursued and the vices to be avoided. It is to inspire the youth to a virtuous life. Another element is an induction into logical thinking and the ability to recognize and avoid fallacious reasoning. Some formal logic, nothing very technical, is very helpful to teach children and young adults that there actually are objectively correct and incorrect ways of thinking. That's just such a radical thought for the youth today, that there are right and wrong ways of thinking. There's a professor friend of mine who says one of the first things he had to teach his students just before he retired, he had to actually teach them that they could think. Now that might sound strange to you, but listen to the youth today. When they preface a thought that they're about to express, they don't say, "I think" anymore. What do they say? Exactly. They say, "I feel." And how can you argue with a feeling? And that means, if you disagree with some of them, it's almost a personal attack because this is my feeling. Who are you to question it? And in a society and in a culture where feelings are increasingly coming to define who we are, rational dialogue and debate becomes increasingly difficult and confrontational needlessly. So just the very plain virtue of learning a little bit of logic is that you just learn that there are valid and invalid ways of thinking. Teaching people to look for and avoid self-contradiction, to identify vagueness and shifting or equivocal meanings of words in debate. You can be debating someone, and when you're really paying attention, often what you'll find is that they start to change the meaning of the words that they're using, and they might not even be conscious of it. They're, in a sense, making it up as they go along. And just a basic training in logical thinking teaches you to keep an eye on it and to bring them back to where you started. It's an invaluable discipline. And again, you don't have to get very technical with it. In other words, even basic logic trains one to destroy arguments. Destroy your own arguments is just as important as being able to destroy others. And destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. In this respect, I prefer to speak of clear and virtuous thinking rather than critical thinking. I'll get to that later. Augustine also said that logic is an evidence for the existence of God, because logical truths are necessary truths. They could not be what they are. And you don't get any necessary truths from empirical reality, from the senses. They tell us nothing other than what is, not what absolutely has to be. And so for Augustine, these are evidence that there is a reality of necessity, an unchanging reality that just is. And for Augustine, that was evidence of a transcendence. And the third thing, so we've looked at literature, logic. These are in no particular order, by the way. An understanding of the complex history of Western civilization in particular, but not necessarily to the entire exclusion of other civilizations, which are always illuminating for understanding our own. If you want to understand Australia really well, read a book on China. It's not a bad idea, just to learn how people historically in other cultures thought, and then you get to see what makes Australia, America really unique. Historians from Herodotus, so what are you going to be looking for in history if you're going to teach it from a humanities perspective? What are you going to be looking for? Historians from Herodotus to our own day show us the effects on national and individual character of war, poverty, and luxury. History teaches us that the condition of human beings as human beings is capable of wicked deeds as much as glorious deeds. History teaches how and why civilizations decay. Studying the Greeks and Romans introduces students to the study of constitutions, the rise and fall of civilizations, civil religion, great insight into cultures lacking the creator-creation distinction. Of course, this is immensely helpful for grasping the change brought about by the rise of Christianity, and also helps one to understand the current character and trajectory of our own culture in the West today. I was just talking earlier about a book called Dominion by Tom Holland, which is all about that kind of thing. History also teaches against the notion that slavery, exploitation, hatred, and every human and social vice you can think of is a preserve of a particular race or culture. All peoples, whatever race, can and have engaged in the worst human atrocities that you can imagine when circumstances permitted them to do so. History also shows the glorious and disastrous results of social experiments. The 20th century in some ways is a testimony to those kinds of disastrous social experiments. We also learn how we became who we are, as individuals even. For as well as being biological creatures, we are creatures with social and mental habits and predispositions that are not inherent to our biology. Some of them are, but not all of them, but are products of historical social evolution. The ideology of cultural relativism, the notion that all cultures are equal is also falsified by history, as we encounter cultures with the cruelest practices imaginable baked into them, and we're able to realize that the dogma of cultural relativism is a strange one indeed. Finally, history also teaches us that God is never without a witness. And even when things appear bleak, there are those doing the work of the kingdom of God effectively. Think, for example, of the evangelical revivals of the 17th and 18th, of the 18th and 19th centuries, taking place at the same time that the Enlightenment is casting off biblical revelation. History is a source of hope. What about classical languages? Classical languages are not only one of the finest trainings for a rigorous mind, but they are the best ways to master grammar. In the 19th century, Thomas Macaulay, a great essayist, and Benjamin Jowett, a professor of classics, set the examination to enter the very prestigious Indian civil service. And they placed a disproportionate emphasis on proficiency in ancient Greek. Obviously not because it would be immediately useful in India, or really anywhere else outside of Cambridge and Oxford at the time, but because they could think of no better way to test one's mental proficiency. Strange as it sounds for the non-initiated, the best way to grasp the richness of the English language is to immerse oneself in Greek or Latin. One does not even need to master Greek or Latin to reap the immense benefits. One need only learn some basic grammar and vocabulary before he notices improvement in written expression and memory. Even if one abandons a classical language, their knowledge of English grammar will remain far superior to one who never studied a classical language to begin with. So even if you forget everything you learned in Greek and Latin, you'll still remember the elements of grammar. That will stay with you. Of course, a full course of either of these classical languages opens other worlds of thought and culture, worlds with which the New Testament writers and early Christians were familiar and were often responding to. So in teaching either Greek or Latin or both, you don't have to go sort of all the way with those languages. Just a basic introduction to them is an absolutely invaluable source of mental discipline for anyone who does it. Science and mathematics. Science and mathematics force upon the student an objective reality and objective truth and error, regardless of interpretation, regardless of feelings. Science and mathematics have always been integral to the liberal arts tradition, especially mathematics. The medieval trivium, the way that you were educated in a university in the Middle Ages, was largely about literacy and expression, grammar, rhetoric, that is the art of persuasion, and logic. But the quadrivium, what you did after the trivium, that was mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy. Certainly a liberal education without much science and mathematics can still be a rich course of study, but it is also incomplete. Now, science is a problem because studying science nowadays is extremely expensive. So, I can understand why some schools would not have much of a science. We don't have a lot of science at Campion. We don't have the money for the labs and things like that. But just to reiterate, a liberal education has always historically included mathematics and science. Enthusiasts for the humanities should also be chastened to some extent by the sciences and mathematics, for it's not from science departments that modern irrationalism and the revolt against reality have principally come from, but from humanities departments. Scientific and mathematical literacy are at all-time lows in the West, certainly in Australia. Mathematics demands black and white, true and false. Science presupposes a reality that exists wholly apart from whether we like it or not. It's objective, it's measurable. We cannot speak or wish it away. Could it be that there is some relationship between the decline of mathematics and scientific literacy in the West and the rise of the talk of gender as opposed to objective biological category of sex? Once we lose focus on disciplines that demand right and wrong answers, that insist on an objective reality, it's easy to see how an ideology like transgenderism can become plausible to a generation of youths. And it's baffling how it becomes plausible to people sort of the age of 40 and over. I don't really understand that. I suppose I have my views on why that might be the case, but this is not the time. Music and art. Music and art brings students immediately into contact with beauty. Perhaps better, art is the visual representation of the true, the beautiful, and the good. A liberal arts induction into music and art will treat these as objective pursuits requiring objectively tested skills and methods. All the greatest musicians and artists mastered the rules and methods through painstaking practice and discipline, finally to get to a point where they could bend and even break the rules for the ultimate purpose, which is beauty. A truly humane approach to music and art will not define progress in these along the current lines of pushing boundaries. How often do you hear an artwork praised because it pushes boundaries? Whether those boundaries are the sensibilities of the audience or political messaging. Yes, too often art is defined solely in terms of pushing boundaries and social critique. But any child can push boundaries. It's what they do. And any person can criticize what they happen to think is unfair. Neither of those are the point of art and music. And the liberal education understands this. Again, the liberal approach is to enjoy art and music as visual and auditory attempts to capture truth, beauty, and goodness, all made possible with the most painstaking skill and discipline, but also knowing that the rules and methods are but the means to the transcendent ends. The study of music and art also offer one of the most telling demonstrations of what happens to a civilization once it becomes detached from the belief in and the pursuit of objective truth, beauty, and goodness. Witness the trajectory of much art, especially during the 20th century. The decline of art to the mere pursuit of boundary pushing, political propaganda, and visceral shock may be the best objective demonstration available of the power of truth, beauty, and goodness on a civilization, in the same way that the wilting plant is the best demonstration of the objective, nourishing power of water. All of the above disciplines and the rest are to be pursued through a Christian theological lens, if a liberal arts education is to be Christian. And in some ways I've tried to hint at what that lens might look like in practice. The disciplines ought to reveal reality in all its modes: imaginative, moral, historical, scientific, artistic, musical, metaphysical, linguistic, but also show how Christ or a Christian worldview makes sense of it all better than any other approach. And in turn, how the liberal arts facilitates Christian conviction as well. It's common nowadays to praise the purpose or the end of education as critical thinking. You ask people, what are you trying to accomplish in education? They'll often say, oh, we want to teach children or the youth to think critically. You hear it from every university lecturer. It's all about thinking critically. I have a problem with that. I'm wary of this I mean, teaching a child to criticise, I don't think they need much encouragement, but anyway. I'm wary of this because so much so-called critical thinking nowadays is really just critical theory. And our critical theory is a Marxian project of picking apart every vestige of Christian Western civilization. For example, these universities that all say that they pursue critical thinking. Think about this. When did you ever hear of a modern public university education characterized by sustained critical thinking, sustained picking apart atheism and agnosticism, secularism, feminism, divorce on demand, abortion rights, LGBT rights, cosmic meaninglessness and nihilism, non-traditional families, multiculturalism, non-Christian religions? When did you ever hear of a modern education program that in a prolonged, systemic way picked all of those apart and criticized them? It doesn't happen. I suspect you've never heard of something like that. In other words, so-called critical thinking in universities is really just the mind captured by left-leaning secular humanist ideologies. At the end of the day, critical thinking is only valuable when it is critiquing error, never when it's turned against truth and goodness. In other words, so-called critical thinking today really is rebellion, plain and simple. Not so much critical thinking, but virtuous and truthful thinking is what we aspire to. What do we want to teach our children? We want them to be able to think truly. We want them to be able to think virtuously. And when we aim towards virtuous and truthful thinking, then we will inevitably become critical thinkers, not vice versa though, making it less likely to be taken captive, making the mind less likely to be taken captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy. And so the purpose of the liberal arts, or classical education, what you want to call it, from a Christian perspective, is to form a person with the kind of mental character that will delight in the honourable and the pure and the just, and thus be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. In other words, a person whose mind is able to identify and resist the forces and messages trying to captivate her mind to delusion and darkness, and opposed to that, delight in captivity to truth, beauty and goodness as revealed in Scripture, as demonstrated in Spirit-led persons, families and communities, and as explored, interrogated and artistically depicted throughout the history of Western civilization. Would that we had the power to merely will the end of all the dark attempts to destroy our Western Christian heritage and civilization, and take the minds of the youth captive to truth and goodness. But we can't just will an end to these things. We do have it within our power, by God's grace, to form the minds of future generations to resist worldly captivity through hollow and deceptive philosophy. I pray that the movement of Christian liberal arts or classical education continues to grow in Australia as it is growing in America. And I'm strongly convicted that any school that goes down this path is doing all it can to keep the young minds faithful to Christ, but also playing a crucial role in the long-term pilgrimage of our culture back to a fear of God. Thank you very much.
Steve, there's a growing emphasis in modern education on the mental well-being and health of a child, a therapeutic approach to the child. How do you think that gels with a classical education?
A modern emphasis on the mental health and well-being of a child, particularly or sort of a therapeutic approach to a child. How does that gel with a classical education? I don't think they're great fits. Not that a classical education has no interest in the mental well-being of the child, but the thing is that the modern day tendency is to try to protect children and even university age students from anything that might upset them, or to sort of warn them about it with trigger warnings. And the book to read on this is The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, a book that came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And what they show, all the research shows, is that the more you try to protect children from negative thoughts and negative feelings, the worse their mental health will become, because you're making them more and more fragile. Now, this is no revelation to anyone who I think has really lived and experienced this kind of thing, that when you protect people from something, they develop no immunity to it. Now, the thing with a liberal arts curriculum, you're going to be reading books that show really horrible things happening. Of course, it has to be age appropriate, of course. But the virtuous life is often a life of great challenge and great pain and great injustice and triumphing over atrocities, triumphing over things that make life almost unbearable, and the youth have to come into contact with depictions of that. And if they don't, life isn't magically going to accommodate itself to their fragility. It's just going to hit them even harder, because they barely have a conception of what life is really made out of. And of course, we see that happening these days. There's this mental health epidemic among the youth. So when I was a kid, and some of you will remember this film, there was a movie based on a book, a very famous American book called The Yearling. It's a beautiful movie about a boy and his deer. And the film is really about the coming of age of this boy in the context of living in the American frontier, where they're living hand to mouth, they're subsistence farmers, and the boy makes dear friends. There's no one around. The boy makes dear friends with a deer that he calls Flag, and they become best friends. But the problem is the deer constantly is destroying their crops. I won't say much more about the book and the movie, but I would imagine that a lot of people would want to shield children from a children's book like that. But that was written in an age where there was this sense that childhood is a preparation, that there was this sense that virtue is not something just for adults, it's for children too. Children need to learn about hardship in life as well. In fact, that was at an age where it was absolutely unavoidable. And we live in a very luxurious age where our health has never been better. And we kind of saw this during COVID. Might get a bit controversial now, but we shut the whole of society down. We shut churches down. We shut schools down. People were not allowed to go to hospitals to visit loved ones, kept brothels open and bottle shops. It was as though death was a foreign enemy and not a part of the human condition. And I think that is in many ways a sign of a culture that finds it very, very difficult, increasingly difficult to deal with hardship and mortality. And those are some of the very themes of a liberal arts education, and children in a liberal arts education are going to be exposed to those things. Why? So they can see role models dealing with it, rising above it, and maintaining virtue. So I don't think the therapeutic approach to children sits very easily with a liberal arts emphasis. But what I will say is this: I think a liberal arts emphasis and the kind of things that children and young adults will encounter in the great literature are actually much better to prepare them for what life is really made of.
Just a question on rapidly transforming movement and education around artificial intelligence. Is it your inclination that liberal arts should lean in or lean away from some of these changes?
Well, it's never an either or. At Campion, our approach at Campion is that it is just inevitable. Students are going to be tempted, and many will succumb to using things like ChatGPT. They might not use them to cheat on an essay, but what they will do is use them as a shortcut to getting information really quickly without having to read a bunch of articles. I think that's just an inevitable thing. And so what I think that liberal arts educations are going to have to do, and this is the move that we're making at Campion, is more or less, and for no reactionary reason, because the past is necessarily better than the present, but frankly, going back to pen and paper exams and in-class invigilated tests. And still, the way we're probably going to handle artificial intelligence, I mean, there are great things about it. There are not so great things about it, but it's a genuine threat to education, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to detect fraudulent work. And even if you know that the work, I mean, it's not that you don't know that the work is fraudulent. Can you prove it? That's the thing. When a subpar student presents you with an essay that's very, 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 very good, it's exceptional. Yeah, I don't want to be cynical here, but you know they didn't write it. But can you prove it? And so it depends on what aspects of AI you're talking about, but I actually think we're going to have to go back to the kinds of assignments that really make it impossible to do well unless you absolutely have done a lot of slow, deep reading and thinking and discussing, so you can basically perform on the spot. One of the ultimates is, I can't remember which university it was, but one university once upon a time, it was either Oxford or Cambridge, one of the colleges anyway, their end of year exam was the students would sit at the table and they'd turn a piece of paper over and there'd be a single word. And you had to write everything you could based on that word. So one year the word was water. Now, if you've done a classics degree, now it doesn't mean they want a scientific explanation of water, but the point of that test is, if you have spent the last 3 years really reading, really thinking, really discussing, you'll have something to say. Thank you, Nick. Yes.
Thank you very much, Steve. Really enjoyed your brilliant talk. And as about trying to then work out how then the liberal arts education will apply to really Charles, our future girls school, could you give a quick summary of how a liberal arts education will help things like entrepreneurial? So if we're going to have the parents and march through institutions, we need people who are able to donate or Christian entrepreneurs to be able to help philanthropically support these institutions that are doing great work. What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, wow. I mean, what are my thoughts are briefly? Well, none, but that's never stopped me from giving an opinion before. I do, after all, appear on Sky News. Well, I mean, there's a sense in which the beauty of a liberal arts degree, a liberal arts education, I should say, is that there is a kind of sort of built into it, there is a kind of liberty in it. The idea of the liberal arts is a kind of education, a kind of pedagogy that doesn't restrict anyone to one way of thinking, that allows them to think about problems from multiple perspectives. And if I can give an example, I've got nothing against lawyers. I know we've got lawyers in the room. God bless you all. Interestingly, in St. Thomas More's book, The Utopia, there are no lawyers. And Thomas More was a lawyer, so that was one of his little jokes. You'll read that book if you do, a liberal arts education. But when you are talking to a lawyer about a particular issue of current importance, what the lawyer will often do is conceptualize it almost completely in terms of a legal problem. And that's understandable because they have received a legal training. And so they are going to approach it as a legal issue. And I've actually spoken with doctors before and spoken about ethical issues with them, and they often find it very difficult to talk about it from an ethical point of view. They try again to reduce it to a medical point of view. And it's understandable because they've received very specific trainings. The idea of a liberal arts is that it's something that sort of precedes any more technical, narrow training that you might have. And what it allows you to do is to think about problems from all sorts of different perspectives, from the perspective of what you've learned in literature, from philosophy, even what you learn in art. It's really something that's supposed to, I know I sort of spoke against free thinking earlier, but it is something that is supposed to allow your mind to be able to range widely over different perspectives to a particular problem. And I think that is something that every entrepreneur has. There's a sense in which I think that you're never going to be able to teach someone to be an entrepreneur. It's like a lot of things. A lot of it just depends on the personality that you have. Some people are just really proactive and entrepreneurial. Other people, not so much. But I do think that, again, another one of the benefits of a liberal arts is that it teaches you, here's something that's really important about it, it teaches you to be able to express yourself. It gives you a vocabulary, it gives you concepts, it gives you words to use to be able to express yourself very, very clearly. And when you can express yourself clearly, your mind can range much further. Our thoughts are to a large extent limited by what we can actually articulate linguistically. And the liberal arts education, in a sense, frees you to be able to speak and express yourself. And that is something very, very important for exploring different ways of thinking about various problems. And that's something that entrepreneurs often have quite a gift for. That would be the best answer that I would have to that question. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, we've got a gentleman at the back and the gentleman in the middle. So we've got two more, and should we finish with those two?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll offer shorter answers. Yeah. Well, yeah, the question is, what can a liberal arts education do to ameliorate or improve the situation of political polarisation in the modern West? The first thing I will just say is that a liberal, and you've not suggested this with the question, but a liberal arts education is not going to fix that. That is a result of all sorts of social changes, technological, economic, warfare, that have been taking place over the last 70 years. I can't go into that too much, but what a liberal arts education will do, any good one anyway, it does expose people to great texts, and those great texts are going to be from, here's the thing, great books in the history of Western Civ have been written from multiple perspectives. And so no great texts course in social theory
Yes.
is going to skip reading Karl Marx or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or any other theorist who wouldn't be considered conservatively inclined. So at the very least, what a liberal arts education does is that it puts people of a particular persuasion in direct contact with people from the opposite persuasion. So, and this is where the universities are, in my opinion, lacking. So when you go to university, you don't, I majored in political science. I actually taught political science for 10 years at Macquarie University, political theory anyway. Now, I'm the exception. I did actually teach Edmund Burke. But generally speaking, you do not study in any great depth the conservative thinkers in a university. You sort of bypass them a little bit, and you'll tend to study the more left-leaning radicals. That's part of the problem in a way. Jonathan Haidt is very good on that. He himself said throughout his whole university education he never studied conservatives. And one day he picked up an anthology of conservative writings. He couldn't believe how deep the tradition was. And it brought him from the peripheries of the left over more to the centre. And so one of the benefits of a liberal arts education that might have something of a salutary effect on polarisation, although I don't want to exaggerate the effect it'll have, is that it just forces both conservatives and non-conservatives to read one another's best thinkers. And that is a transformative act.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. One last, I will be shorter this time, I will promise you.
There's two parts to the question.
Oh, you're a tricky, a sneaky, yeah.
The first part is, what do you believe caused the transition from going away from a classical education some 70 years ago?
That's actually really easy to answer. The rise of post-World War II science and prosperity. Education went much more utilitarian.
Right.
Yeah, Menzies writes a lot about it at the time.
The second thing is, we're living in a generation that is not tending to be critical thinkers in the true sense of that word. How do you sell a liberal arts curriculum to our current society gimmick?
Yeah, okay, so first I should just say that first question was when did the move take place from a kind of liberal arts emphasis in education to a more economics, technical, utilitarian one? That was. Now the second question is, how do you sell liberal arts to a modern society that might generally be indifferent to it? First I'll say, you're never going to sell it to everyone. You're never going to sell everything to everyone. But you know what, I didn't bring this up in the talk, but let me say this. We are in a subliterate culture. Young people are hardly reading. They're getting all their information through images, through sounds. There is no substitute for reading to strengthen the mind, improve the memory, improve one's ability to articulate oneself, just be able to just carry a kind of gravitas with you that goes with reading serious literature. And so if I can just be honest, I honestly believe that those children and young adults who go through something like a great text liberal arts education are they're kind of going to have mental superpowers. And I say that because culture is going in such a way that you never had to work less to get the information that you need to get by. And again, ChatGPT, that is only going to encourage students to do the simplest thing to get a barrage of pretty decent information to pass their course. But they're going to be left with minds that to someone trained in the classical way are quite evidently, quite manifestly feeble. And so how would you sell a liberal arts to a parent who cares about the education of their children? Basically just like that. Your child will just stand apart from everyone else in an increasingly subliterate age.